I recognize. So, just listening to that description that I wrote, so it should be familiar to me. But I'm like, God, this guy is all over the place. Focus, right? Pick a topic. And that's always been really challenging for me to narrow it down. And um, this presentation over the course of the next hour and the next 4 weeks will give you a window into kind of how broad this book, the Torah, that is composed of texts written over 1,000-year period from slightly different places in the Middle East, specifically in the land of Israel and maybe in Babylonia as well. Um, how many different kinds of ideas spin out of these texts? And so, as Ari said, he didn't really say this. I'm going to say this. This is going to be a hard set of sessions to really follow. I am going to do my best to make it intelligible the first time around, but then I'm going to keep looping back to these ideas as we go through the Torah, and next week, the rabbinic period, and then the third and fourth weeks, the medieval period, looking at philosophy and Jewish mysticism. So this is the most important of the sessions because this lays the foundation for the other sessions coming up. But if you're not entirely sure that you've gotten it this time around, we will be looping back many times. Okay, here we go. Okay, slideshow from beginning. All right, so I was telling Ari that the way I would say this in an academic setting is not the mutually exclusive operating systems of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I would say the mutually exclusive, I hope you're sitting down, ontologies. Ooh, right? Ontology is a branch of metaphysics, another one of those words that I'm not going to say because it intimidates people. So we can think about it as an operating system. And what I want to say at this beginning slide is that I am 57. I started studying religiously when I was 25. So, that's 30 years. And I never was under the impression that the Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai in one blow. Like that was never part of what I imagined any book to be, let alone the Torah. But when I heard about multiple authors, it didn't really click that those multiple authors would also have different theologies and different metaphysics and different operating systems, right? That I just figured, they've got different economic agendas, they've got different political priorities and preferences, but it turns out that as I learned more and more about the biblical material, wow, part of what the disputes aren't just whether you can allow the blood that is spilled from an animal sacrifice to go on the ground or whether you have to cover it, right? Those seem like relatively small things, but there is a whole metaphysical set of assumptions about the nature of blood that is behind what Leviticus has you do, which is cover up the blood. And what Deuteronomy has you do is just to make sure that the blood is spilled. And if it spills on the ground, you don't have to worry about cleaning it up. All right, but let's get into some more interesting things. Okay. Leviticus gets its name because it was a book that dealt with the Levites, that at least in English. So I'm just reminding folks that once upon a time, before the Levites got the tap on the shoulder to become the priests for all of Israel, it was the oldest son in the family who had that responsibility. And then you see in this quote from Numbers, right? God sets the Levites apart from the rest of the Israelites. And setting apart is going to be a key word. Setting apart, distinguishing, um, dividing. I have taken them for myself in place of the first issue of the womb, which used to be, right, of all the male firstborn of the Israelites. So Leviticus deals with Levites rather than the firstborn of each family. Already you're getting this idea of separation, but let's dive into the world of separation because scholars agree that the book of Leviticus and Genesis 1, the creation story of Genesis 1, both are priestly documents. So we can talk about, and the way I talk about these ideas is the priestly Torah. And in the priestly Torah, there is an incredible emphasis on divisions, on orders, on separation. And we see God doing all of that stuff in Genesis 1 with creation. And we also see God speaking. So the ideas of speech and separation are going to be key for the priestly Torah. Now, I say that the first thing God does maybe is bara, because the first three words, the way we have them in the Hebrew Bible, are bereshit, in the beginning, bara Elohim, God created. Bara is a verb. But grammatically, there's a problem, and so many scholars wonder and suggest, including the New Jewish Publication Society, suggests that it shouldn't be read Bereshit bara Elohim, but Bereshit baro Elohim. In the beginning, or when God began creating, that baro might be a gerund, which would mean that the first thing God does isn't to create, but is to speak. But let's say that it is create. Let's go with it in this. Bara we translate as create. It's something that only God can do, but it certainly does not mean creation out of absolute nothing. And so already in the 12th century, we had a commentator, Ibn Ezra is his name, that says bara is better understood as cutting off, separating, or dividing. So on the stage of creation, at the moment when God begins creating, there's this kind of swirling, chaotic mass, and God separates that swirling, chaotic mass into an ordered cosmos. God doesn't create anything that hadn't been there before, but God separates and makes and distinguishes what's already on the stage. And when I went to the Accademia, maybe in Florence, Italy, and I saw these 4 Michelangelo statues that are alternatively called the prisoners or the slaves, it just plugged me right in to this idea that what the artist is doing is chipping away at what is potentially present but unseen. And so I just thought this was a beautiful representation of cutting off, separating, and dividing in this big chunk, which looks like it is a uniform block. But what the artist is doing is showing you how manifest and glorious the inside can be when it's properly revealed. So this quote, this biblical quote that I have, is, I think, the best example of the biblical use of bara that doesn't mean create. So this is from Numbers, and it says, but if Adonai brings about something unheard of, so that's the word create, right, that we would translate as create. But what does he do in bringing about something unheard of? He opens up the ground, right? He separates the land to open up the ground. And so when Ibn Ezra in the 12th century defines bara as cutting off, separating, and dividing, he gives lots of quotes where that verb appears with that meaning, which include this passage from Numbers, as well as Ezekiel and Joshua. In the book that I just finished, that Ari mentioned, Coherent Judaism, I suggest that Yud He Vav He, that 4-letter name of God, might be understood as letting being become. And that's what I have at the very bottom of this slide. Yud He Vav He, might mean letting being, the nature of what is, become what it is yet to be. And we are created in the divine image, meaning that we are works in process ourselves, right? I want to make sure to get the pastoral religious piece of this in, and so that it's not just academic. And that we should be letting the potential that we have in our being to become that which is more like God. Okay. So if it is when God began creating and the world was chaotic, God spoke. That was the first thing God did. And speech in the priestly Torah is constructive. So I'm not just talking about when you say something, you can't take it back, right? You can't unhear something. I'm talking about speech really honest to God, influencing and constructing reality. When you get married, it's not the ketubah that effects, with an E, that effects the marriage. It's the boy saying, Hare at mikudeshet, behold, you are consecrated, you are sanctified to me. It is as a result of the power of those words that that new reality between the husband and the wife comes into place. And that's why it's the boy who has the power to dissolve that vow. And that's why it is only the man who can initiate divorce, right? So I'm introducing this halachic problem, the halachic problem of the agunah, of the straw widow, the recalcitrant husband who won't give his wife a divorce, because the laws, the halakha of the straw widow, of the agunah, the anchored woman, are rooted in this kind of operating system where it's the words that created the world, and therefore it has to be the words that dissolve the world. If you think about how crazy it is that Jacob steals the blessing from his dad, Isaac, takes advantage of him because he's blind and he's able to take advantage of him, right? The question that I was asked 12 years ago that got me started on writing this book is, why didn't Isaac just take back the blessing? Why didn't Isaac just give the blessing that he was duped into giving to Jacob? Why didn't Isaac give it to Esau? Right? Isn't that a great question? But that presumes that language isn't intrinsically powerful. Because in this world that Isaac and Jacob and Esau inhabited, once someone speaks words, it creates a new reality that you have to deal with, right? King Ahasuerus is coming up, right? King Ahasuerus told Haman that he could, that all the Jews could be killed on this day. And then Esther says, well, wait a second, I'm Jewish. King Ahasuerus can't undo what he did with Haman. So he has to say, well, okay, then Jews can go on a rampage and kill anybody they want on a previous day so that they won't be victimized by what I had been duped into saying to Haman that I can't backtrack on. Okay. Finally, abracadabra, Bereshit bara, bara, abara is I will create, or I am creating. Kidabra, medaber is to speak. Ka is as. So abracadabra is this idea of creating through speech. Okay. Now I'm going to give you the academic quote. I didn't say devar, the word devar, right, which is ledaber, to speak, in Hebrew means both word and thing. The same word means thing. So the idea between what the word is that you're saying and the thing that the word represents is somehow part of its essence. That's built into the Hebrew language. Okay, so here's the academic way to say it. All created realities are in their first manifestation words. The words are incompletely developed forms, presentiments, signs of realities which, God willing, will come to their full scope. To use words to say something has occurred, even though it may not have occurred, is to introduce a preliminary form of this reality into the world, and in effect to invite God's willingness to bring it to fulfillment. Language is constructive. Language changes the world. Okay. Not the way we're used to thinking about language. I've got 3 slides on how the God of Genesis 1 creates. Etymologically, in terms of the language of bara, I just want to point out that anybody who likes meat in Israel will get something called a like a mixed meat dish. So Erev is when day and night even out. Day and night is when things get jumbled. And so kind of a mixed meat is with that same ayin resh bet root. Boker means to clarify or to distinguish or to separate. In the creation story, you have the separation of light and darkness, day and night, upper waters and lower waters, waters and land. Flora is created according to its kind. You have that emphasis on everything being accorded to its time. The sun and the moon are, the language of sun doesn't appear, but the large luminary is to separate the day from the night. And the seventh, and another temporal distinction is the 7th day. Okay, that's obviously not happening on day 4, but Shabbat and the holidays have a different character in reality, in their essence. We'll talk more about that in a second. Animals are separated, no crossbreeding. Even the pure animals, right? What's a kosher animal that has a cloven hoof, right? A separated hoof. The only animals in the Torah who have fingers are humans. There's one mention of monkeys, these animals that come from Africa, this exotic animal that we don't really know too much about. But the only fingers that are mentioned in the Torah are God's fingers and human fingers. And humans, right? What we are going to see and what will undoubtedly be offensive is how in the priestly Torah, Gentiles are distinguished from Israelites through male circumcision, and the division within the world of the Israelites. This separation of humans is what's responsible for the prohibition against male-to-male intercourse. It's part of this priestly Torah, as well as bestiality. And I'm just pointing out that in this priestly Torah, there's also a separation for purposes of marriage and for purposes of clothing, as well as for purposes of agriculture. You can't yoke 2 different species of animals together. So this idea of separation is all over. Okay. So hierarchy, etymologically, means the rule of a high priest. And that's what the priestly Torah is. So in this world of separation in the priestly Torah, you've got the high priest, you've got the priest, you've got the Levite, you've got the Israelites. I didn't write it down, but you've got the mumzer. So a mumzer is an illegitimate Jew, an illegitimate Israelite. And then at the very bottom of the pile, you've got the Gentile. And what this means in terms of this hierarchy is that the high priest has something that the priest doesn't. And it's not just a ascribed power. It's an intrinsic power. It's an intrinsic holiness. So if I wanted to be nice about it, I could say this is racialist. If I didn't want to be nice about it, I would use another word. Okay. So if you think about the book of Leviticus, it deals primarily with priestly issues, right? So that's why I call it the Priestly Torah. I'm just going through the first chapters of the book. You've got all kinds of sacrifices, issues of ritual purity, kashrut, leprosy, Yom Kippur, sexual transgressions, the calendar. But you notice that I put in black and bolded interpersonal ethics. Okay. I'm doing that for a very specific reason, because I don't want anybody to think that ethics is secondary in the priestly Torah. It's not. But there are so many other issues that the priestly Torah deals with. You could be excused into thinking that the priest thought that these other issues combined were somehow more important than interpersonal ethics. This is exactly what the Protestants who developed the academic study of the Torah taught for 150 years, until Jews got into the business and showed them how wrong they were. So I'm going to show you an example of what it meant to write in a very elegant, scripted, choreographed way 3,000 years ago. Okay. On your left is a ziggurat. For those of you in Orange County, right, there was the old IRS building, the Ziggurat. I didn't know what a ziggurat was when I moved to Orange County. It is like a pyramid, but it has steps and different levels on it. What made a literary composition particularly eloquent was that the literary composition was built like the temple. That the literary composition mirrored the geography of the sacred space, so that the sacred text conformed to the model of the sacred space. And so the ziggurats were a temple. And what it means is that the top is where the altar is. The top is the closest to God. The top is where all the action happens. What you have on the right, my friends, is a Protestant pyramid. And in the Protestant understanding of Leviticus, it is Yom Kippur that is the summit. And what is Yom Kippur? It's about atonement for your sins through a blood sacrifice. I'm going to say that part again because it's for the Christians. Yom Kippur is about atonement for your sins through a blood sacrifice. This is not Jewish. And I want to give you the best reason why it's also incorrect. If you look at Leviticus 19, that's where you've got all the good stuff in terms of the moral interpersonal ethics. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't hold a grudge. Don't take vengeance. Don't put a stumbling block before the blind. That's Leviticus 19. But if you take a look at the chapters on either side of Leviticus 19, they're the same. They're both about sexual transgressions. And so they're on the same ring of the ziggurat, right? They're on the same level. They cover exactly the same material. Leviticus 20 gives you the consequence of committing these transgressions. Leviticus 18 just tells you what the transgressions are. But that demonstrates that they're on the same rung. And then above that is what's in the middle, Leviticus 19, the ethics. So we're going to move on now, but I want to make sure that no one thinks that just because ethics is not spoken about in the Priestly Torah as frequently as it is in the book of Deuteronomy, that it makes it any less central. It doesn't. Okay. Theology, favorite topic. So this is the Priestly Torah. Okay, so we're still in Leviticus. What God is a force shield. That's not the right way to say it. A force shield, force shield, shield force. It protects, and it's life-giving. And when I say it protects, in the context of a nation, that Bnei Israel, the Israelites, were coming into being in the land of Israel, it means that the presence of God assures national security and national prosperity. This is going to start to sound familiar to everybody, I hope. So when the divine presence is driven away as a result of our transgressions, we lose the force field. That's the word, force field. Okay, we lose the force field. And that makes us vulnerable to our neighbors who have designs on our sovereignty. And it also makes us vulnerable to droughts. Okay, I'm on the right side now. When transgressions are inadvertently committed, the divine presence is still repulsed because we drive the divine away through our transgressions, regardless of intention. Intentions don't matter in terms of the natural consequence of God's repulsion. It's like bringing two magnets at the wrong end together. It doesn't matter what your intention is, they are going to be repulsed. Okay? But sacrifices, animal sacrifices, vicarious sacrifices, meaning sacrifices that aren't you personally, they can atone for those oopses, for those whoopsies, for the inadvertent transgressions, if you combine it with tshuva, with repentance, with reorientation. But for the intentional transgressions in the Torah, in the priestly Torah, you're killed. Right? That's why the person violating Shabbat and the person taking God's name, they were killed. Because whether they meant to do it or not, they damaged the fabric of the universe. And the only way to repair that damage was through a blood sacrifice. And since what they did was intentional, they paid with their own lives, as opposed to being able to rely on God's mercy for inadvertent transgressions that would allow you to substitute Bessie or Bambi or another kind of animal. Yoni Klawans, professor at Boston University, he puts this into a nice little paragraph. Moral impurity, right? The stuff from Leviticus 19, when you or 18, 19, and 20, the top of the ziggurat. Moral impurity results from committing certain acts so heinous that they are considered defiling. And now here we have the rabbinic big three. Such behaviors include sex, idolatry, and murder. Right? The big three that, according to the Talmud, you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed rather than commit yourself. These to'evot, these abominations, bring about an impurity that morally, but not ritually, defiles the sinner. And then it defiles the land of Israel. And then it defiles the sanctuary of God. This defilement in turn leads to the expulsion of the people from the land of Israel. Okay. What Yoni wrote here, I agree with 100%, but he is trained in, he is not a philosopher. So when he says this defilement leads to the expulsion of the people from the land of Israel, does it lead to their expulsion as a punishment or as a natural consequence? That's the question. It leads to their expulsion as a natural consequence. All through Leviticus, you have the language of vomiting. Vomiting is not volitional. Okay? The land vomited out the Canaanites when their sins had polluted the land, and the land will vomit out the Israelites if our transgressions pollute the land. Now, the next couple of slides are meant to show you just how, okay, and here I'm going to use a technical term, wackadoodle this operating system is. I need to really convince you of two things. A, that this is really their metaphysics. It's really their understanding of the cosmos. It's really their operating system. And it is, from our point of view, completely magical. Wackadoodle. Okay. This is right before the giving of the Decalogue, right? You shall say, God is speaking, set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, or even touching the border of it, because God's going to be on that mountain. And that means the mountain is going to be godly. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death without being touched. Why does it say without being touched? Because if you touch somebody who's touched the mountain, you have transitively touched the mountain. So they've got to be put to death either by being stoned or being shot. And it doesn't matter if it's a beast or a person, right? That entity, that species shall not live. But the giveaway here is that they have to be put to death without being touched. It's the transitive property of holiness. During COVID, I explained this to my congregation so that when we walked around with the Torah, they didn't all have to congregate and kiss the Torah. They could just kiss the person next to them with their seat, and then it could go down the row and kiss the Torah. And according to the Priestly Torah, that is completely legitimate. Why? Because whatever touches the altar shall become holy. That's what it says at the bottom from Exodus 29. And that means that it is sanctified. It's not a figure of speech. It really means it becomes holy. And this, from 2 Samuel on the right, this shows you that it's part of the cosmos. It has nothing to do with intention. This guy, Uzzah, is walking along with the ark that's on a palanquin, that's on some kind of a stretcher, and the ark of the Torah is starting to wibble wobble. And so Uzzah puts his hand out to steady the ark of the Torah so that it doesn't fall and crash. He's killed for that. He's killed for that because it's a natural consequence. He came into contact with a level of divinity that was overwhelming, and it overwhelmed him. Intention is irrelevant in this system. And as I say that, it's not completely irrelevant, because if you sin without intention to sin, then you're offered the possibility of vicarious atonement through an animal sacrifice. So there's still a place for intention, but you can see how secondary it is in most instances. Okay. And finally, and I do mean finally, we're about to wrap up the Priestly Torah. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge being blood, this is just a normal period. Whoever touches her shall be ritually impure until evening. So just like whoever touches the altar becomes ritually pure, Whoever touches a menstruant becomes ritually impure. But it's not just that. It's not just leprosy. It extends to what scholars call a miasma, a cosmic elemental humor. When I was doing my research on this, I learned that the word gas was coined by a 17th century chemist, a Dutch chemist, to sound like the word chaos, because gas is unpredictable in its spreading. So when you enter the land of Canaan that I'm going to give you, and I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house in the land that you possess, whoever enters the house when it's closed up shall be impure until the evening. There's something about walking into the space that contaminates the individual. So it doesn't even have to be direct contact. It can just be coming within the domain if it's a closed domain. Okay? And many of us know this, that, the Bible has these weird things, but it hasn't necessarily informed our understanding of the philosophy that informed the halakha of these different schools of thought. Okay, so here we go. This is a scholarly text, and it's now going to introduce the distinction between the Priestly Torah and what I'm calling the Mosaic Torah. The Mosaic Torah is Deuteronomy, and the adjective for Deuteronomy is Deuteronomistic, which I have a lot of trouble saying. So it's much easier for me to say the Mosaic Torah. And Deuteronomistic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is more than just the book of Deuteronomy. It also includes many of the books in the of the prophetic history. Okay. What I have up top, the headline, that's the headline. For the Priestly Torah, the cosmos is moral. For the Mosaic Torah, it's the covenant with God that's moral. So morality still plays a key part, but they are accessed through different means. I'm going to read this and then I'm going to take questions. Okay, so I'm giving you a heads up. Prepare your questions. The priestly system of holiness is a cosmic system. It presupposes a certain divine cosmic order, like the invisible architectonics of the universe. The covenant between God and the people of Israel is inherent in this cosmic system. We, Jews, are part of that cosmic system. And the people of Israel have a central place in the spectrum or the pyramid of holiness. However, this system is not static and uninterrupted. Under certain circumstances, it might be threatened, such by pollution and sin. Indeed, one means of protection in this dynamic system of holiness is ritual, sacrifices. In contrast, according to the Mosaic concept of holiness, the cosmos and nature are irrelevant. The holiness of Israel derives from God's will. It's a legal status with no implications on other aspects of the world order, and it is not affected by operating systems, ontological, or cosmic situations. If ritual is practiced, it's only because God has ordered so. It's not to repair the cosmos. It's a consequence of your misdeed, right? You sinned, so now you're punished by offering a consequence. Okay. I'm going to stop here for a second because that was a lot of information. And I'm going to take a couple of questions. Irene Lancaster raised her hand. I like that about Irene Lancaster. You have to unmute yourself.
Just so you know,
Yeah.
historically, you can choose, but we don't unmute people for a variety of reasons, connection. People tend to give lectures rather than ask questions. So I ask people to put their
Got it.
questions into chat. We can read them and understand them. So I think let's just do
Okay.
that. We have too many people. We have 150 people. So
Okay.
let me help by facilitating. There is, I mean, one point was Adria Evans brings up the deaths of Aaron's sons for getting too close um, to the inner sanctum of the
Yep.
tabernacle. That would fit into the Levitical approach. There were questions from Arnold Sugarman about the difference between Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Is that a battle between the priests and the prophets? We're going to get there. Arnold also asked a question about today, do we have people in the Jewish world who are still very strictly, you're going to argue there's two different views, the Mosaic worldview, the Levitical worldview, and by your topic, Leviticus Christianity, but don't we have Jews who actually still believe in this cosmic force field view? I think we see it in Israel right now, where we have Haredim who believe that studying for Torah creates this cosmic protection of Israel, and that's why they're needed to do that and not fight in the army. So don't we still, you're setting up this division, but do we really have this division in Judaism today?
Yeah. So we have the division. It's just not clean. So that's why I think that the title of my next lecture next week is Leviticus is Christianity mostly, and Deuteronomy is Judaism mostly, right? Because we're going to look at some exceptions. Okay. Yeah, the prophets here. I don't want to set up the conflict between priests and prophets. That was specifically why I emphasized the ethics of the priestly Torah. Okay. The the clash between priests and prophets is a fossil of Protestant biblical scholarship. Right? It's how they read the Torah, and Jewish biblical scholars and many non-Jewish biblical scholars today understand that that was tendentious and wrong. Okay. All right. So now we're going into the Mosaic world, my friends, the Mosaic Torah. We are a people consecrated to your God. We're not any different compared to other people. We're just different to our God. We have a special relationship with God. We are not in our kishkas in this cosmic system of the priestly Torah. We're no different than any other human being. God has ascribed certain statuses to people. You can see in what I underlined from Deuteronomy 17, Levitical priests. It's no longer Levites and priests. So these sharp divisions that existed in the priestly Torah get blurred in the Mosaic Torah. And what I want to emphasize more than anything else, because it is not racist, it's still privileging, right? We're still the chosen people, but we're the chosen people because of a relationship, not because of our essence. Okay. And the God of the Mosaic Torah is the God that has been enshrined or canonized in the prayer book. That when we're good little boys and girls and obey the mitzvot, we get rain in our season. And when we are bad little boys and girls and whore after foreign gods, God will shut up the skies. That is the standard reward and punishment system that I think many of us thought was the theology of the Hebrew Bible. And so I'm here to bring the priestly theology and to tell you that yes, reward and punishment is one of the theologies, but it's not the only one. And since I find the reward and punishment theology both insulting and wrong, I prefer that Leviticus, the priestly theology, that as a result of our actions, we either attract or repulse the divine presence. And Many of you might have thought that the priestly anthropology, their understanding of human beings, was what Judaism thought, that in our kishkas, Jews are essentially superior or more divine than non-Jews. That is one of the ways that the Bible describes humans. But in the Mosaic Torah, everybody's equal. And so it's this ideology, it's this operating system that says in Amos, you Israelites are just like the Cushites and the Ethiopians, and you're just like all the other people to me, right? I've got a special relationship with you, but that doesn't preclude me from having a special relationship with other peoples as well. Remember that in the ancient Near East, a boy could have multiple wives. And so that metaphor, that marriage metaphor of Israel and God does not preclude God from having other peoples as wives. Okay. But whether we're talking about the priestly Torah or we're talking about the Mosaic Torah, the end goal is the same. To the end that you and your children may endure in the land that God swore to your fathers to assign to them, as long as there is a heaven over the earth. National security and national prosperity. Those are the goals of both Torahs, the priestly Torah and the Mosaic Torah. If you were to be at a cocktail party and someone who is from an Eastern religion says, "Oh, you're Jewish. What's the Torah about? I've heard about the Torah. What's the Torah about?" On one foot, depending on how much you've had to drink, but let's say on one foot, the Torah is about getting the Israelites to the land of Israel, keeping them there, and once they've been exiled, getting them back. That's what the entire narrative arc of the Hebrew Bible is. The last words, the last pasuk, the last verse of Chronicles is the Israelites coming back from exile in Babylonia to Jerusalem. That's literally and literarily the last sentence of the Hebrew Bible, as opposed to the last sentence of the Old Testament, right, that introduces John the Baptist, who will then feature at the very beginning of the New Testament as the one who outs Jesus as Messiah. So although there's overlap in the books between the Tanakh and the Old Testament, the different order that they're in belies their different narrative arcs and their different theological agendas. So the religion of the Mosaic Torah, theology is what we think about God. Theology is what we think about God. Religion is what we should do based on what we think about God. So theology is about God, religion is about what we do based on our theology. And so it's pretty similar, right? It's about mitzvot. It's about love, right? Love comes up a lot, as you'll see. It's about keeping the mitzvot. It's about becoming morally sensitive, cutting away the thickening of our hearts. And specifically, we should be focused on the most vulnerable populations in our society, the fatherless, the widow, and the illegal alien, not illegal, the alien, right? Food and clothing are the most essential pieces. And then over and over and over again, right? The aliens who are coming from outside don't have the network that you do. They don't have the protexia, the influence, the ability to make things come together when they're in a pinch. So you have been in that situation in Egypt. Make sure that you treat them better than we were treated in Egypt. Richard Elliott Friedman points out that there is no other source in the ancient Near East that talks about the protection of aliens the way that the Torah does. One of the characteristics of the Mosaic Torah is the centralization of altars around the land of Israel. It used to be that you could offer up a sacrifice wherever you built an altar. But that changes in the book of Deuteronomy. One of the consequences of those changes is that if you screwed up and you want to offer a sacrifice in order to atone for your transgressions, you either have to go to Jerusalem, which could be a long schlep, or you got to do something else. And so, although the idea of teshuvah was present in the priestly Torah, all these words that I've bolded, return, return, take you back, restore, again, heed, once you return, these all have the root shuv, shin vav bet, teshuvah. And so the prominence of teshuvah becomes raised in the Mosaic Torah because you no longer have altars in order to engage in the animal sacrifices all over the land of Israel. And this is the last slide. So Ari, prepare some questions for me. This is a pretty good chart showing the differences in all these different areas. So in terms of human beings, the priestly Torah divides it up, as opposed to the Mosaic Torah, where God ascribes a certain status, but it's nothing intrinsic. The theology, God is repulsed and attracted by our actions, natural consequences, as opposed to reward and punishment. So because we are heirs of the entire Torah, it is completely legit, and the rabbis do it also, although I don't do it the same way the rabbis do it, to accept the Mosaic anthropology and the priestly theology, right? You don't have to stay in one column. And we'll see next week that the rabbis didn't either. So language in the Mosaic Torah is just conventional. It's what we think of as language, right? It can affect how people think, but it doesn't affect what is outside of people's minds. Okay? Purity system, right? There's a real miasma. The impurities have a real effect in the world, as opposed to in the Mosaic Torah, an ascribed moral covenant that can be compromised by your actions. Notice that the religion of mitzvot is the common denominator between these two Torahs. So the religion of mitzvot leads to national security and national prosperity. Through the priestly Torah, it's having God's protective presence in the camp. And through the Mosaic Torah, it's through laws that create a modest utopia by protecting even the vulnerable. In the Mosaic Torah, wisdom and leadership are emphasized. Look at that. 8 times in Deuteronomy, we have the word chokhmah, 0 in Leviticus. And teaching, right? We talk about Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. That's a rabbinic moniker for him, but he's teaching all the way through. And Vishinantam levanecha, we're supposed to teach our own children, right? As Heschel said, we're supposed to teach them diligently, not vicariously. It appears 17 times in Deuteronomy, never in Leviticus. And the altars, you can see, also allowing for teshuvah to become more prominent in the Mosaic Torah. So you can already see where the elements of the Judaism that is the post-temple Judaism that we know of has more in common, really because of teshuvah, with the Mosaic Torah than the priestly Torah, but we'll get into the developments much more next week. Okay, happy to look at questions. Ari, do you want to feed me any questions?
Yeah. So Sharon asked just in when different books were written from the approach that the Torah is written by people, different times. Was Deuteronomy written later than Leviticus?
Yeah. I mean, I can just say that quickly. Yeah, Deuteronomy was written later than Leviticus. In general. It also might be that certain lines made it into Leviticus later than the bulk of Deuteronomy was written. But even now, there's real speculation about exactly what was written when. But in general, there is agreement that P, the priestly source, predates Deuteronomy.
Stuart asks a question, is it fair to say that God is immanent in Leviticus and transcendent in Deuteronomy?
Yeah, so we're trying to apply contemporary theological terms. And, you know, if you're going to do that, then the immanent and transcendent distinction might work. But the priestly Torah is really about immanence and transcendence itself. Because when you do the good stuff, when you do the mitzvot, and when you undo the bad stuff through sacrifices, that makes God immanent, that brings God near. And when you do the bad stuff, that pushes God away. Now, is pushing God away transcendent? That's not really what it means theologically. Okay. All right.
Ellie asks, with respect to Deuteronomy, what were the political or ethical logistical considerations in the changes? Let's just focus, for example, on the change of making Jerusalem the only place to go to do sacrifices.
Okay. So we have I don't want to say a consensus, but more biblical scholars tend to the opinion that the book of Deuteronomy may have been written after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. The 10 lost tribes were exiled by the Assyrians all over the Assyrian Empire. So the 10 lost tribes weren't on a hike and got lost. They were dispersed so that they lost their corporate identity. So they weren't together. When the Babylonians later exiled the Judeans in 586 BCE, the Judeans were exiled together, and Judaism emerged when the Judeans were no longer in Judea, but wanted to keep doing Judaic stuff. Okay? So Deuteronomy was probably composed in the decades after the Israelite kingdom was conquered and exiled. A bunch of those northern Israelite cousins, estranged cousins, went to Judah. And so it would not be unreasonable to think that all of those recommendations to love the stranger as yourself and to not mistreat the stranger may very well have been your estranged Israelite family member. So that's one ethical piece. I mean, you've also got you just have a much more developed set of laws around business and agriculture than you do in the priestly Torah, right? The priestly Torah is about calendar, it's about food, it's about ritual purity and leprosy. So you've got a lot more of the kind of day-to-day, non-cultic, non-ritual things in the Mosaic Torah.
I don't have the ability to fact check it the second, but Naomi says that Jerusalem is actually never mentioned in Deuteronomy. So
correct.
there you go.
Yeah, but they talk about the place where God's name will, the place where God will cause his name to be known. And so that turns out to be Jerusalem. I mean, theoretically, it could have turned out to be a different city. But although Jerusalem is not mentioned in Deuteronomy, the place where God will cause his name to be known, which is the way to say the temple, it's all over Deuteronomy.
Here's a question from Ephraim to you asking, what do you think about the argument or thought that King Hoshea of Judah is believed to have written Deuteronomy?
Um, I'm not qualified to answer. Like I want to be proud of what I think I've come up with, and I want to be totally transparent about my ignorance. I don't know enough to even venture a guess on that question. I'm not a Bible guy. I'm a Jewish thought guy who's been working on these issues for a long time now. But I don't read Akkadian or Ugaritic, and I just don't know the history. I don't know biblical history well enough to answer that question.
And of course, there probably is no definitive answer to that question. There's just different theories. I will say that people have said, since you are both a clergy, active clergy, and an academic, are people afraid to ask you questions during Kiddush?
No, no, people don't seem to be afraid to do anything to me. I wish that I would inspire a little more fear or awe, but I've got to work on projecting my intimidation factor.
I will add, based on the first part, the Levitical discussion about the power of words, and you gave the example of marriage. When I was at Maimonides school, and I'm sure this happens a lot, two students who were at probably the third grade got up and did a marriage ceremony, and they said those magic words, and the rabbis went apoplectic and made them get a divorce.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they weren't even bar bas mitzvah yet.
No. Had to get a divorce.
Wow.
That was, yeah, the power of words.
Yep.
I will also say that CSP is very happy to have an abracadabra t-shirt in a magical charm. So we'll be sharing that, everybody. And
Cool.
if you're going on a trip or just need that extra protection, it's something that you can wear. Power of prayer and words. Can you tie that into anything that we've been talking about yet?
Yeah. So let me just say, we're going to talk much more about that next week, but prayer is the substitute primarily for sacrifice. Because sacrifices were so regimented and so choreographed, that's why prayer is so difficult to change. I hope everybody understands that. It's not that these prayers were written by people who have, um, insight into language that is going to move God, which I sometimes hear. It's that as a result of the function that prayer serves, which is the same function that sacrifice served, just like the sacrifices couldn't be altered, hence Nadav and Abihu, right? It becomes incredibly difficult to change the formulations of prayer. But that's only if you believe the system, right? That's why Reform and Reconstructionist prayer books can be so creative. And it's why the conservative movement, tries to do as little potchkaing as possible. And they prefer to have a low with an aleph instead of a low with a vav, something like that, so that at least orally it's the same.
We did host Rabbi Naomi Levy, though, in a conversation just recently, and we talked about this issue about prayer and what it really started off and how flexible it really was. And yet, as you pointed out, it's become inflexible.
Yeah, Professor Kimmelman said that it used to be that whenever you would add something to the Siddur, you had to take something else out. But from the 3rd century forward, the Siddur enlarged or increased by about 10% century.
It's a note from Sharon saying a Christian friend of hers told her in church, prayer is paramount as words are what God used to create the universe. She had never heard that from any other rabbis or teachers before. We do, or many synagogues do, certainly in the traditional world, conservative, Orthodox, maybe, on the Shabbat, I believe a Yom Kippur, read from Leviticus about, in the afternoon, about the sexual improprieties, which becomes very offensive to the LGBTQ plus world, and so synagogues are changing. Why do you think we read that there? Why are we introducing that on our holiest day?
So thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about that, Ari. We think about incest today in terms of health and in terms of the yuck factor. Incest back then was about the Me Too movement. It was about men taking advantage of women with whom they had close proximity and power over. And the placement of Leviticus 18 during Mincha of Yom Kippur was the way that the rabbis were pounding the table, saying, do not take advantage of your power and proximity over the women in your domain. It's a real kind of Me Too moment. I understand about the LGBTQ community with the verse in question, but I will say that in my minyan in Brookline, we alternated between Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 19 each year. And we had a meeting about it, and somebody at the meeting said that she was an incest survivor, and that by reading Leviticus 18, it felt like she was being seen and that she was being protected. And that's a perspective that I don't think we hear enough of.
Okay, thank you. Last question for today, and then maybe a promo for next week. How close does Levitical Judaism that you outlined tie into other theologies in the world, particularly maybe Egyptian theology? Or is that a question you do not want to go near? Because it does seem from the clothing, from the sacrifices, from the theology to be very similar, which then ties into other questions about our history in Egypt. But it does seem like Judaism got something from somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. So that book is by Ari Berman called Ani Ma'amin. Is it just in English, or is it just in Hebrew? I think it's just in Hebrew, but it's an English book. And he goes through the dress and more importantly, he goes through the architecture, the blueprints of the tabernacle in Egypt and in the desert, and then later in Jerusalem, and shows you just how much Egyptian influence there was. So the answer is a lot. And the other thing that he and other scholars note is that it seems to be that only the Levites were in Egypt. Only the Levites have Egyptian names. And so the ideology of the Levites that becomes ethical monotheism may well have originated in the sands of the South.
Thank you. What's the name of that book again?
I think it's Ani Ma'amin.
Okay, so we'll follow up in an email.
Yeah.
People have asked if they can have the slides as well. We'll talk about that as a follow-up. There's a lot of people want to read. I want to thank you for this introduction. As a Kohen myself, I appreciate you elucidating my history. I tell my kids, but particularly the young boys, that their great grandfather was, of course, Aaron, and Moses was the uncle, and we got a lot of power. But now, of course, you've clarified my ideology, so I can sit down tonight or Shabbat dinner and explain what we Levites think to my children. I'm sure they'll appreciate that.
No doubt.
If they eat their dinner. So anyway, thank you. Promo for next week. What are we doing with you?
Oh, so next week we're going to take a look at a bunch of different disputes in the Talmud that seem to be completely like they had too much time on their hands. I hate people thinking that about the rabbis, because the rabbis, like that, those are our guys, right? So I'm going to show you that from these two ideologies, from these two operating systems, that's what generates some of these disputes that seem so unintelligible otherwise. And we'll look at how Christianity develops with the Levitical system, and we'll look a little bit more about how Rabbinic Judaism develops with the Mosaic system.
Great, thank you. There'll be a follow-up email. Do not worry, everybody. We'll try to answer some of your questions. Appreciate your time, and wishing you all Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you on Sunday.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Thursday,
Thank you.
we're in the zone. Take care.